Okay. Let's look at Chavin de Huantar. So Chavin de Huantar is high in the Andes Mountains. Um, you can see the mountains in the back here. It consisted of a series of ceremonial buildings, um, temples, plazas, platforms, and there was, as you saw in the film, there's something very very interesting about the art that was depicted. You had these stone heads depicting a little bit like the Olmec, were jaguars or sort of half human, half jaguar type figures. You had also the depiction of snakes. You had caimans, which are these small alligator like creatures. You had bats. And one of the interesting things, well, there's a lot of interesting things, but one thing that's very, very interesting is that all of these kinds of animals are from the Amazon. They're not found in the Andes Mountains. So you have this large complex. All the animals depicted on the artwork are animals that are not found in that area. They're found in the Amazon. So either the religion came from the Amazon or there was contact with people in the Amazon. We're not exactly sure. You also saw how they constructed things like this temple with all these ornate interior tunnels specifically for religious ceremonies. And they even diverted water through these kind of aqueducts within the temple, not for irrigation or agriculture, but for auditory effects to enhance the ritual when people were engaged in it. We also saw, well, you saw from the film, that hallucinogens were used. There's several pieces of evidence. One, you can see the stone heads have mucus coming out. They found also snuff tubes, which is probably how they ingested the hallucinogen. And then you also have this kind of shaman-like figure, this half human, half jaguar with snake hair, holding this cactus called the San Pedro cactus, which is a plant that has hallucinogenic properties and is found in the area. So you could imagine that they would be performing ceremonies here involving the hallucinogens. People then would be, select individuals would go through this ritual. They would crawl through these dark tunnels, and they would end up in a chamber that was lit by a shaft of light coming from the ceiling with this really ornate sculpture showing this kind of were-jaguar figure standing there as well. Right? And that would certainly make a big impact. So ritual, religion, this is something that was able to bring people to the site. The site had a very, very wide influence over the area. There were no fortifications around it, so there was no real warfare at this time, but the style of Chavin art spread far and wide through the Andes. You can see a beautiful conch shell that was carved, probably used as a musical instrument, more of those stone jaguar heads, more depictions of that kind of shaman-like figure holding hallucinogenic plants. So it took a lot of labor, obviously, to build these buildings. But just like Corral and just like Chavin, where just like Corral on the coast, and just like La Venta in Mesoamerica, this did not have a large year-round population. So it looks like mainly a ceremonial site that people would make pilgrimages to at different points throughout the year and give their labor and their surplus and things like that. All right, so this is how complex societies developed in South America. Next, you have states. The very first states appear on the coast first, along the narrow strip, and this culture that developed is known as the Moche culture. One of the hallmarks of Moche art are these beautiful effigy-like pots. I'll show you some more of these, but unfortunately, there's been a lot of looting of Moche sites because these kinds of pots are so desired by collectors that there's a lot of illegal excavations that occur. You could kind of guess what sort of agriculture would work here and what agriculture would not. There's almost no rainfall. So the only way to grow crops is through irrigation agriculture only, which means that people had to live near the rivers. So these were areas of cities centered around rivers, separated by deserts. Remember Carnero's circumscription idea, where he believed that warfare would result from societies where they could only expand so far because they were circumscribed by the environment. Carnero worked in South America, so this was kind of the Moche were one of the models that he used for that idea. That there's only so much you can expand. Eventually, if your population gets too big, you might fight with one of your neighbors. That may explain a little bit the rise of Moche states. So the Moche were not one unified state like Egypt. Right? They were more like the Maya and Mesopotamia in the early dynastic period. That is, you had independent city-states with their own kings that were sometimes at war with each other. You could see some of the beautiful Moche vessels over here. So you've got animals, you've got some sort of leader, and then you have warriors. We're going to see the importance of war in Moche life, right? But you also have all these other everyday scenes. So this is one of a llama. Here you have a fawn with a you can fawn with the mother doe, a deer. And here you have something that looks like a shaman healer. You can see kind of in a trance, laying their hands on this person lying down, probably the patient. Here's a monkey with a seed pod. I always think this looks like a Big Mac, but obviously it isn't. Something else. But you can see the high level of art that went, and skill that went into making these. And you're also going to see that with some of their gold work. So these are some ear spools, very, very finely crafted. Okay, there is archaeological evidence that the Moche used irrigation canals for their agriculture. Some of these canals are still found today. Some of them are actually still used today. Right? So this is the way that they were able to survive in this very, very dry environment. The large earthen mud brick platforms that they built as their temple mounts and their sacred places are called huacas in the local South American language there today. And huacas just means sacred place. So you'll see names describing Moche sites like Huaca del Sol or Huaca de la Luna. This is Huaca del Sol. Right? So you can see all of this is human created. Same with this Huaca over here. You can see how, we're going to see other pictures, how narrow this strip is. The mountains are right behind. The coast is just here. And you have this mud brick platform built by people. So we're talking about states at this period. You can see these are larger than Chavin, larger than Corral, and you have a large settlement outside of the Huaca. This is what it looks like today, right? You could see in some of these the mud bricks show up pretty well, right? Again, all human built. This is what it might have looked like back then. You would have had a very, very large temple and a series of other religious structures on top where ceremonies would have taken place, and also, as we're going to see, burial. You could see the excavation occurring here, and you can see how close the coast is, right? So it's a very, very narrow strip. We're going to see that the temples depict sacrifice. They also depict prisoners and the capture of prisoners being brought for sacrifice to these temples. So here you can see a little bit of that. When these are excavated, the paint is usually still intact. Right? One of the prominent deities in Moche culture is called the decapitator god, because we don't know what the ancient people called him. There's not any writing from the Moche culture. He's called the decapitator god because it's usually a fearsome creature depicted holding a severed head in his hand. You can see here's some depictions here. So fearsome creature, knife in one hand, decapitated head in the other. Here he is in the process of sacrifice. There's lots of depictions also on Moche vessels of war and important leaders who are wearing kind of garb that makes them stand out from some of the other people in the scene. You see this on a lot of Moche art. A lot of pottery have these kind of decorated scenes. So this is a scene from a Moche pot, and you can see here's a leader of some sort, right, holding some sort of mace or standard, and someone else before him. And then you have these kind of, looks like a priest over here, and maybe some sort of god over here, and then a captive with their hands tied behind them, and another captive with their hands tied behind them, and blood coming out of the captive. So it looks like people captured and then sacrificed before the leader. So pay attention to this kind of ceremonial headdress, because you're going to see it again, and you're going to see it from a tomb, and that allows us to draw a connection to the figure wearing this on the pot and the figure buried in the tomb. All right, so here you get, again, you see the scene of sacrifice. Looks like some sort of jaguar kind of figure, right? And same over here, another scene of sacrifice. Sometimes you'll have a leader sitting on a throne and then captives being brought to the leader. Here it looks like these naked prisoners are bringing elite prisoners, right? So some prisoners are being carried, some prisoners are doing the carrying. These are probably the elite ones. Here are the scenes of the sacrifice, right? Some sort of bird-headed figure and a human sacrifice here, decapitated head, right? Here you can see warriors fighting each other, right? And then warriors you can see with captives. So they're leading these people by ropes. The people are bleeding, so they have been captured by warriors. When a lot of this artwork was found by archaeologists, some archaeologists thought that maybe this was exaggeration. Maybe these kinds of ceremonies really didn't take place. And one piece of evidence that proved that these sacrifices did in fact take place were human skeletal remains that were found in some of these huacas that showed evidence of violence, trauma, decapitation, right? So these were some bodies that were found and they were covered with rain-washed sediments. It doesn't rain very much on that coast, but at one part of the year it does rain a little bit. And it looks like they performed the sacrifice at that time. Maybe it was to ensure that the rains would come, that there would be enough water in the rivers. What they found is that these skeletal remains all had marks of violence on them. They had cut marks, for example, on their vertebrae, and not on the dorsal side of the vertebrae, on the ventral side of the vertebrae, right? So the dorsal side is the back of the neck, and the ventral side of the vertebrae is the throat, right? So in order to have cut marks on that throat side, the ventral side of the vertebrae, it means that that knife had to go in very, very deeply, almost decapitating these people. And then there were also cut marks on the ribs and on the long bones. So the ends of the long bones, like you could see here in what I believe is the femur, right? You can see the cut mark right near the end. This was probably to remove the muscle from the bones. So maybe the skeletons were sort of defleshed before they were laid down on the ground here. We're not exactly sure. But it shows that the Moche are a little bit like the Maya in the fact that human sacrifice was a very important element of the religion. One of the most important things ever found in Moche archaeology is a famous tomb from a huaca called Sipan. It's usually referred to as the royal tombs of Sipan. And the way that these tombs were identified by archaeologists was from archaeologists paying very close attention to the illegal art market. And while they were watching the illegal art market in the 1980s, they saw there was a whole bunch of Moche gold that was being sold. And archaeologists quickly realized that looters had discovered an important tomb, and they were able to track the tomb down to Sipan, were able to get rid of the looters, and then to excavate the tomb very, very carefully. And what they found was some sort of royal leader, a king or a priest king, but someone connected to the type of figure that we saw before on those scenes of sacrifice on the pottery. This was a very important tomb, one of the most important royal tombs found in South America. I'm going to show you a little bit more of what they found, but here you can see some of the artifacts laid out on the body of this priest king. So here's where the mouth is, the eyes, the head, finely decorated with all of this gold and ornate jewelry. The Lord of Sipan, as he's sometimes referred to by archaeologists, was buried in the center. You can see with all sorts of gold, featherwork, beadwork, as we'll see, with human sacrifices around them, sacrificial burials, right? So it's a lot like the royal tombs of Ur in Mesopotamia, where we saw sacrifices to Queen Puabi. Here we find human sacrifices to this king. His younger wife was buried with him, looks like sacrificed. His older wife was looks like she had died before him, so her remains were excavated and then reburied with him. A guard was sacrificed to watch over him. There was it looks like a child, a dog, right, all to accompany this ruler to the afterlife, we believe. Now what they found also is not just all of this ornate jewelry, which took a lot of skill and a lot of craftsmanship and also a lot of time, but they found this kind of headdress that is identical in shape and size to the one we saw on the pottery. So this individual here is probably the same kind of leader that we saw on the pottery vessels. He's also holding a mace, just like the one that was shown in the pottery as well. He was covered in this beaded mantle. All of these beads were made by hand from shells from the ocean. Each one was cut and drilled by hand and then stitched together to form this very, very elaborate beaded mantle. So that took an incredible amount of work. And this is maybe what the Lord of Sipan looked like in life before he died and was buried. You can see that one of the themes of Moche gold work are peanuts. Right? Peanuts come from South America. They were domesticated in South America. So these golden peanuts, right, along the mantle, as well as other gold, these very ornate decorative spools, right, part of the headdress, and then the elaborate headdress that we mentioned before, and the kind of mace or standard or symbol of royalty that he's holding. So from the artwork, from the tomb of the Lord of Sipan, and from some of the other evidence we looked at, we could see that in Moche society, kings were very important, and a lot like the Maya, their role in religious ritual was very, very important as well. And the Moche, just like the Maya, engaged in capture or capturing of people from other cities and the sacrifice of these captives on their important ceremonial structures. And this was an important part of their religion and also how the state functioned. Okay, you can see another one of these huacas with the mud bricks over here. Okay, around 750 AD, about, or 650 AD, the Moche civilization collapsed. The Moche state collapsed. So for the Moche approximately are the same time as the Maya, but they're a completely different culture, and there's no connection between them. One's in South America, one's in Central America. They don't have trade with each other. They're developing on their own. But around 650 AD, the sites are abandoned very suddenly. What does the archaeological evidence tell us about what was going on? Well, it looks like, and you can see the storm here on the Pacific coast, it looks like that the environment played a large role in the end of the Maya. Right? So unlike Teotihuacan, where the people of Teotihuacan destroyed their own environment, they cut down the forest, they destroyed the local environment, and destroyed their agriculture. With the Moche, it was a natural climate variation, a natural change in the weather patterns there. The Moche had a 30-year period of floods. And during this 30-year period of floods, you can see a lot of structures were damaged, right? Floods can destroy crops, and there was a lot of damage that was done to the Moche society. That 30-year period of drought was then followed by 30 years of 30 years of floods was followed by 30 years of drought. And so this kind of double blow really spelled the end for the Moche, and the Moche made it even worse by fighting even more amongst themselves over resources, and this just made their downfall happen even sooner. But ultimately, what caused the end of the Moche was a natural climate change. Okay, well, the Moche are only one culture. There are numerous state societies in South America. And we're not going to look at all of them, obviously, because that would take a whole semester. You could take a whole semester's class on South American archaeology easily. But I do want to mention the Nazca culture. They were a state culture, state society on the desert coast. The reason why I want to mention the Nazca is because they are very well known today from the lines that they created in the desert. You can still see today, because there's no rain in the desert and there's not any wind-blown sediment to cover up the lines that they etched out in the desert floor. So the surface of the desert is kind of a dark brown, and right underneath is sort of a lighter color. They dug into the surface in order to create these wonderful designs. Like you can see, here's a condor, here's a monkey. Right? They had a hummingbird, a spider, and also lines as well. These lines were used to connect or to basically mark out important peaks and important landmarks, important religious landmarks. The animals represent animals from the creation story of this area. And so what they did is they created a ritual landscape in the outdoor desert environment. It was almost like creating an outdoor temple. They carved important religious scenes in the desert floor, and these you can still see today. Right? One of the other states that appear in South America after the Nazca appear in the mountains, right? So we talked about the Moche on the coast. Now let's take a look at the mountains. So after states appear on the coast, later on they appear in the mountains, and the very first state in the mountains appears on Lake Titicaca, and this is the state of Tiahuanaco. At Tiahuanaco, they had a very large city. They constructed a very large city with, again, all of these religious areas. They're known from, or they're famous today from a religious structure you can see with all these blocks of stone. It's known as Pumapunku, but it's part of Tiahuanaco. But the people who lived in Tiahuanaco, who lived in the Andes, had a challenge living in the mountains. And the big challenge occurred with how do you grow crops in this area? Because one of the hard things about growing crops in the mountains is that at night the temperature could drop very dramatically, and frost could end up forming on your crops and killing them. And Tiahuanaco was one of the earliest states to develop on potato agriculture. So they grew potatoes, and they had to figure out how could you grow potatoes in this high altitude environment when the temperature might drop below freezing and the frost could could kill your crops. And they came up with a brilliant strategy. What they did is they created what we would call today raised fields. Right? These were canals that were dug, as they dug out canals that would be filled in with water, they piled the dirt in between the canals. This created raised fields. Now, during the day, the sun would beat down, and water retains heat much better than land or air. And so at night, after being in the sun all day, the water would be relatively warm. It would retain that heat, and even though it might drop below freezing, the warm water on either side of the raised fields would prevent any frost from forming on the crops and prevent the crops from dying. So it was a brilliant strategy that worked, and really allowed the people of Tiahuanaco to live in this high altitude environment. And it's also one that it was rediscovered by archaeologists today to be used by local people. So in the 60s or 70s, when the UN was trying to revamp the agriculture of the local people, who had by this time not known of these raised fields for many, many years, they were looking into all these very, very expensive methods requiring irrigation and tractors and things like that. And archaeologists who discovered these raised fields in the archaeological deposits recommended that the people retry this ancient strategy. And they did, and they found out that this strategy was less expensive and also more efficient than anything anyone had come up with up to that point. So it really was a benefit, archaeology benefiting the local people with a real practical solution to agriculture. Another famous part of Tiahuanaco's culture you can see is this, what's sometimes called the Gateway of the Sun, but this is not actually the sun god. This is Viracocha, who's, you won't have to remember that name, but even though it's called the Gateway of the Sun, it's actually a different god over here. Right? Okay, the last society we'll talk about in South America are the Inca. And the Inca was an empire. Right? So just like other empires, they conquered territory, incorporated the territory into one political unit or one empire. You'll see that they conquered a territory that stretched all the way from Ecuador in the north to Chile in the south. We're talking about an area that's 2,000 miles in length, and that posed some serious challenges for organization. But we will talk about that in the next video.